Tonight, we're covering the Sapa, Vietnam disappearance of Jamie Taggart, a British scientist who reportedly vanished in northern Vietnam in 2013 and was never found. This is one of those Vietnam disappearance cases that feels less like a story with an ending and more like a story that simply stops. And that may be what makes it so disturbing. In a place known for mountain fog, steep trails, and remote trekking routes, a person can be surrounded by beauty and danger at the exact same time. Sapa sits in the mountains of northern Vietnam, a region widely associated with trekking, highland scenery, and routes that can quickly become isolating when the weather shifts or the trail disappears. It is the kind of place people travel to in search of silence, distance, and something unforgettable. But silence can be comforting right up until the moment it becomes total. And in cases like this, the landscape itself starts to feel less like scenery and more like a final wall between what happened and what anyone can ever prove. The disappearance of Jamie Taggart stays in the mind for a simple reason. There is no clean answer, no neat resolution, no final piece that lets the story settle into place. There's only the image of a man entering one of Vietnam's most haunting mountain regions, and then vanishing so completely that the case continues to linger long after the facts run out. That kind of absence is difficult to process, because it leaves the imagination with too much room to wander. When people hear about an unsolved disappearance, they often look for the usual anchors: a final message, a recorded sighting, a witness who remembers something odd, a clue that narrows the possibilities. But in a setting like Sapa, those anchors do not always exist. Or if they do, they disappear into a much larger problem. Terrain can widen the search area so quickly that even a small misstep becomes a major mystery. One wrong turn does not sound dramatic in ordinary life. In a mountain region, it can become the entire story. That is one reason this case carries such a strong atmosphere. The fear does not come from noise. It comes from distance. It comes from imagining how fast a normal day can break apart when a person is alone in unfamiliar terrain. A path that looks manageable in one moment can feel completely different an hour later. Light changes. Landmarks fade. The route begins to look less certain. Confidence drops. Panic arrives late, but once it arrives, it changes everything. And that is what makes the Sapa, Vietnam disappearance of Jamie Taggart feel so unsettling even now. We are not dealing with a case that offers dramatic closure. We are dealing with a void, and the human mind does not like voids. It tries to fill them. It imagines scenarios. It weighs the possibilities. It replays the same terrible question from different angles. Was this a tragic accident in harsh terrain? Was he disoriented, exhausted, and too far from help? Or did something happen that had nothing to do with the mountain at all? Those possibilities create two very different kinds of fear. The first is the fear of nature, the idea that the environment can overpower a person quietly, almost invisibly, without anyone realizing the danger until it is too late. The second is the fear of human uncertainty, the possibility that another person might know more than they ever said, or that one missing detail could have changed how the entire case was understood. When a disappearance remains unresolved, both fears survive. Neither one is ever fully dismissed. Sapa adds its own weight to that uncertainty. It is already a place many people picture in a very specific way. Mist rolling over hills, narrow mountain roads, terraces cut into the slopes. trails that pull travelers farther out than they expected to go. Even before you attach a disappearance to it, the setting feels cinematic. Once a case enters that landscape, the place itself becomes part of the mystery. The fog feels heavier, the trails feel longer, the silence feels more watchful. What makes that especially effective for a slow-spoken true crime narration is that you do not need to force the tension. The location already carries it. A person listening late at night does not need graphic detail to feel unsettled by this story. They only need the image, a man in the mountains, a route that becomes uncertain, a region vast enough to swallow a timeline, a final answer that never arrives. Sometimes mystery is more powerful when it stays still. Cases like this also remind us that disappearance stories are rarely dramatic at the beginning. They usually start with something ordinary, a plan, a route, a period of time that seems manageable, a belief that coming back will be simple. That is what makes them frightening. We like to imagine that danger announces itself clearly, but often it doesn't. Often it begins with a decision that feels too normal to worry about. And by the time that decision reveals its cost, the window to correct it is already closing. If Jamie Taggart did become lost, then the mountain itself may explain as to why the story never came back whole. Harsh terrain does not preserve a narrative for investigators. It breaks it apart. It scatters time, direction, and evidence into something much harder to reconstruct. The environment does not care about closure. It does not arrange clues in a helpful order. It only keeps moving. Weather changes, ground shifts, trails blur, and once the search expands beyond what can be controlled, the case begins to feel less like an investigation and more like a struggle against the scale of the land. But a deeper reason people stay drawn to this case is not only the physical setting, it is the emotional shape of the story. A disappearance is haunting because it suspends grief in a different form. There is no final scene to hold on to, no definitive conclusion to accept. Families, investigators, and strangers are left with a question instead of an ending. That question does not stay still. It grows. It follows people. It returns when they least expect it. And over time, it becomes the loudest part of the case. What happened in the last confirmed stretch of Jamie Taggart's journey? That is the question at the center of everything. Was there a moment when he realized he was no longer where he thought he was? Was there a point when the route stopped making sense? Did the silence around him feel peaceful at first, and then wrong? Did he believe help was still close? These questions are painful precisely because they cannot be answered. They ask us to imagine the final uncertainty of a stranger whose last chapter was never recovered. And when a case remains unresolved for years, the mystery changes shape. At first, people search for facts. Later, they search for meaning. They begin to ask why this case still unsettles them more than others, why this one stays in memory, why this disappearance feels more vivid than cases with far more information attached to them. The answer, I think, is that the human mind fears being erased without explanation, not just dying, but disappearing into a place so vast that certainty itself cannot follow. That is the nightmare hidden inside many wilderness and trekking disappearances. It is not simply that something went wrong. It is that the world may never tell us exactly how. The absence becomes permanent, and permanent absence is one of the hardest things to process because it denies us the comfort of sequence. We want to know what happened first, what happened next, and why it ended the way it did. In a case like this, that structure collapses. All we are left with is possibility. There's also something deeply unsettling about how quiet a disappearance can be. Not every mystery arrives with chaos. Some arrive with stillness. A person is there, then they are not. No dramatic scene, no visible struggle, just a widening gap between where someone was expected to be and where they actually are. In urban cases, cameras and crowds sometimes reduce that gap. In remote terrain, the gap can widen beyond reach. That difference changes how a case feels. It becomes less immediate and more dreamlike, which in some ways is even worse. Reports tied to Sapa and nearby mountain terrain in other incidents show that people can and do become lost in the region, which reinforces how plausible and dangerous that environment can be, even without assuming anything beyond the facts we have here. That does not solve Jamie Taggart's disappearance. It only sharpens the unease around it, because once you understand the setting, the mystery does not become smaller. It becomes more believable. And sometimes what is believable is far more frightening than what is sensational. So much of true mystery comes down to what the landscape can hide. A city tends to leave traces. A remote mountain region can remove them. That contrast matters. It means the same event can feel completely different depending on where it happens. In one place, there might be a timeline. In another, only silence. And in Sapa, silence feels like an active force. It feels like something that settles over the story and refuses to lift. If you strip this case down to its most basic form, it becomes almost unbearably stark. A man traveled into a remote and beautiful part of northern Vietnam. He disappeared. He was never found. Everything else is interpretation built around that fact. Every theory, every question, every late-night discussion begins there and ends there. That kind of simplicity can be more haunting than complexity, because it gives the mind nothing solid to push against. And maybe that is why this case still lingers. It captures a fear that is both physical and existential. The physical fear is obvious: isolation, difficult terrain, and the possibilities of getting lost where help cannot reach you in time. The deeper fear is harder to describe. It is the fear that a person can vanish from the world and leave behind no final sentence, no final explanation, not even a final place that others can point to and say, this is where the story ended. But stories like this do not really end. They remain open in a way that solved cases do not. They keep breathing in the background. A listener hears the name once, and months later, it returns without warning. Jamie Taggart, Sapa, Northern Vietnam, a missing man, an unanswered question. Some mysteries become memorable because of what investigators discover. Others become memorable because of what they never do. And that may be the most chilling part of all. Somewhere in the distance, between a known destination and an unknown final moment, the story broke apart. Somewhere between intention and outcome, something happened that no one has been able to restore. Whether the explanation was tragic, simple, complex, or something no one considered, the result is the same. The mountains kept the ending. So tonight, when people search for the Sapa, Vietnam disappearance of Jamie Taggart, they are really searching for more than facts. They are searching for shape, for certainty, for a way to close a story that still feels unfinished. But some cases resist that. some disappearances remain fixed in the imagination precisely because they do not resolve. They leave us standing at the edge of a trail, looking into fog, knowing that somewhere beyond what we can see, the truth exists, and knowing at the same time that we may never reach it. That is what makes this case linger after the narration ends. Not the noise of it, but the quiet. Not what was proven, but what was never recovered. In the end, all that remains is a place, a name, and a mystery that still feels as if it is waiting in the mountains of Sapa.